Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a really good opportunity to have some great discussions. And I really look forward to hearing how you got along. And it is my hope that you covered as many issues as possible. So we're going to get a brief feedback from the different groups. So the rapporteurs from each of the breakout group will be brought onto the stage one by one. And for each one of them, we have 3 minutes so that they can share with us the 2 or 3 proposals from each group. To the rapporteurs, I just want to say, please stick to your 3 minutes as much as possible. And again, the same challenge that I'll give you, the one that I gave the speakers earlier, try to be succinct, give us the best that you can, and but in 3 minutes. A reminder to all of the question that we're answering this afternoon. What should G7 leaders do in the long term in order to achieve transformative change and tackle the structural barriers to gender equality and the fulfillment of women's and girls' rights? So once we have received all the feedback from the groups, we will then invite Diana from the UK government and give her a chance to respond. So I think that's our plan for this afternoon. So let's hear what was discussed. Shall I start with Ella Hopkins, who is representing the group on women's economic empowerment? Ella, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Amanda. So I'm reporting back from the Women's Economic Empowerment Group, and we wanted to start by saying that the current economic model and financial architecture has not been working for women and has in fact been exploiting women. And so in order to tackle the structural barriers to gender equality, the G7 really needs to prioritize radical change and a new economic model. On sustainable, inclusive and just global recovery, the G7 really needs to move from rhetoric to action, and that needs to be accompanied with resources. We also discussed challenging the narrow focus on financial inclusion that many G7 countries have adopted in recent years, and instead call on the G7 to think of women's economic empowerment in terms of recognizing the central role that public care services play, including universal gender responsive social protection schemes, but also in terms of increasing and not hampering countries' fiscal space to promote progressive economic policies that would support gender equality. And we're thinking of this both on the expenditure side, but also on the revenue raising side, so raising taxes in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact women. And this was mentioned earlier, but we think is really important is the G7 considers the limits of private investment, which is often promoted as a kind of silver bullet solution. And we're thinking particularly about public-private partnerships, PPPs, which are often discriminatory and particularly exclude women in rural areas, but also carry huge risks in terms of debt liabilities and then austerity policies further down the line because of debt. And then last but not least, we really wanted to emphasize vaccine inequality as a real urgent area where the G7 really needs to step up to support, for example, the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines. And just to underline that countries' access to vaccines is really a precondition for any progress on reducing inequalities and particularly gender inequality going forward. So that really needs to be an urgent priority.
Thank you so much, Ella. Thank you so much, Ella. I'm not going to try and repeat what you've said, but I think the key message for me from that group that I heard was really about the current economic model has not delivered. I hope that you're all sharing this information on social media because we need to engage as many women as possible from across the world who, for one reason, are able to join us here. So I would like to move on to Katie Chadwick, who is speaking on behalf of the group that was looking at violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. Katie, over to you.
Thanks so much. Yes, I think some of our points follow on very nicely from what Ella was just sharing. Our group would also like to emphasize that we need to move beyond rhetoric to tangible commitments. So that means getting more funding to violence against women and girls and GBV services and prevention. And it means transparent mechanisms for delivery. So we need funding for women's rights organizations. We need funding for specialist services that reach women and girls in all their diversities, and especially minoritized women. And we need to get funding to those on the front lines. The specific funding mechanisms, such as what works to prevent violence on evidence-based programming, are really important, but we also want to acknowledge that that funding doesn't always work for different women's experiences, and we need to be reconsidering those models and how they can reach more women in women's everyday realities. We also wanted to highlight that women's specialist services are currently being included in procurement services, and those don't work. Specialist services need to come out of public procurement regimes and to return to grants. We wanted to talk as well about accountability mechanisms. So how do these asks feed into processes elsewhere, such as the Gender Equality Councils, and how are countries meeting their legal and ethical implications, such as the Istanbul Convention. So G7 countries in particular need to implement their legal and ethical commitments to countries in the Global South. And then all of this, of course, is happening within the COVID framework. COVID emergency has eroded rights, not enhanced them. And, you know, as speakers earlier have highlighted, it's really made stark the inequalities that exist, you know, within and across countries, and that it has affected different women differently. So structural inequalities are a reality everywhere, including in the UK, and this needs to be reflected by the G7. So it's not business as usual. We need radical new ways of working together. And finally, we also wanted to emphasize the importance of digital violence and making sure that we are addressing violence that's happening in digital spheres as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that. Very quick and succinct. Again, I think I hear a thread there that is coming through, moving from rhetoric to action, accompanied by resources. Can we move to the next rapporteur, please? I think I would like to invite Haja Shari, who is speaking on behalf of the Women, Peace and Security. Haja, are you online?
Yes.
I can hear you now. Perfect.
The overall recommendation from our group can be summarized in one sentence, that systemic problems require systemic solutions, which yet has not been fulfilled when implementing the WPS agenda. This also includes the fulfillment by the members of the G7 themselves. We discussed several key issues. On top of them is the Women, Peace and Security policy coherence, that members of the G7 should be framing their policies, including foreign policies, humanitarian action, and domestic policies in a coherent manner, and that members of the G7 should ensure that they commit to domestic application, because this is also linked to countries who are declaring as having a feminist foreign policy. And this extends also, for example, to the Westler Declaration and how G7 member states should also hold themselves accountable to it. The second thematic issue is participation. And we're talking about participation in decision-making processes and peace processes at all levels. Our recommendation is that G7 members should look into mechanisms that ensure participation, and participation also extends to the role grassroots women play in peace building. This was particularly apparent and demonstrated clear during the pandemic. And whenever we're talking about participation, it's also important to say that participation needs to go beyond peace tables, but this should also extend to all areas of political, public, and economic life. And to do that, G7 member states should also think of redefining the peace table in a way that ensures that all contributions of women peace builders are involved in the peace table itself. Third thematic issue is protection, something that was very important to many of us in the group. And we're talking about the protection of women peace builders, again, at all levels, including understanding, and this is very important, understanding why we as women are at risk. And this will enable members of the G7 to adequately address the issue of protection against violence that is tailored and targeted against women peace builders in particular. Another thematic issue was disarmament, and this is definitely relevant to members of the G7, taking into account that some of them are arms exporters themselves, but this also links closely to a large-scale defense spending and that state's position right now on nuclear weapons, for an example. Another key issue, which is very important, and it's been highlighted throughout our discussions, which is funding for women rights groups and peace builders. Such funding should be accessible, flexible. There should be a way to trace the funding and ensure that the way it flows is friendly to women groups on the ground. And last but not least, this is more of a general recommendation that G7 member states should ensure that they recognize women, peace and security, and that this agenda is connected to all areas of gender equality, and this extends to violence against women in the form of sexual and gender-based violence.
Thank you very much, Haja. Thank you for that. You've touched on a subject that's very close to my heart. In my work, I have traveled in a number of countries where you see a lot of internally displaced people or refugees coming out of conflict. And the issues that you're talking about in terms of some of these systemic problems require systemic solutions, and this must be fulfilled. I think this is a very strong message to come from your group. I think the issue of protection is also another one that I think is a very strong one, and I hope that it's being heard, as well as participation, redefining that peace table. All right, then, thank you so much for that. Let's move over to Anna Darling, who is giving us feedback from the group on girls' education. Anna, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm feeding back on behalf of the girls' education group. So there was 4 key points that we wanted to highlight. The first is we want to reframe girls' education as gender transformative education. So stop seeing education and girls' education in a silo and actually look at the whole systems approach. So taking a systems-based approach to education means tackling the barriers that stop girls and children from learning, including violence in the community, early marriage, teenage pregnancy. We need to tackle these barriers in order to get girls into school. But the second key point is that it isn't just about access. We're seeing lots of targets and priorities about getting girls into school, but we really want to highlight that it's not just about getting bums on seats. It's about what girls learn in school and what happens when they're actually in education. And education can be seen as a tool to promote gender equality. You know, how can education promote climate justice? How can education promote gender justice? How can we help girls be leaders and promote gender equality? So we have to prioritize feminist education, whether that pedagogy, having female leaders and teachers, and making school a safe environment, and comprehensive sexuality as well, education as well. The third is a really key point, and we had 2 young people in our session who highlighted this as well, is that we must listen to girls and let girls lead. So we want to stop kind of saying "and girls" and actually include them in the discussion. You know, girls are rights holders and they must be central to gender equality and tackling gender inequality. And we want to stop seeing young people as special guests at events, for example. We will have to see them at the decision-making table, and specifically in G7 spaces and in national policy forums. We need to make sure that they are inclusive and that young people and girls can be included in those. And then finally, but possibly most importantly, just but agreeing with the other speakers, turning rhetoric into action, is that we absolutely have to address the large funding gap in for education that exists at the moment. You know, we were already in an education crisis. We are in a further education crisis because of COVID, and without vital funding and funding the right places, you know, gender transformative education that we've said, we can't deliver education and we can't deliver gender equality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. Just on time. Again, I hope that everybody else can hear the threads that are coming through as the rapporteurs are giving us feedback. Another message there around resources, another message around systems, you know, a systematic approach to educate the issue of education. But one that is new that I want to sort of flag up is that feminist education. You know, what is going to open up the barriers for us? And I think it's really important for us to really look at that and make sure that that message of a feminist education that addresses issues of power and structure is and to commitments. Okay, so let's move on. I think we're doing time. We're moving on to Spogmai Ahmed, who is going to give us feedback from the group that was looking at health.
Thanks so much, Amanda. We are encouraged to hear about the possibility of a political declaration on sexual and reproductive health and rights issues, and are really grateful for this opportunity to be visionary in our thinking. So the three main points that our breakout group focused on were data, funding, and the importance of intersectionality and cross-cutting issues around SRHR. So on data, we recognize how the COVID-19 pandemic is really forcing us to look at data in new ways and to make our best and most intentional efforts to recognize those who are most left behind. We encourage governments to work meaningfully with civil society organizations and practitioners to expand the scope of our data collection, finding the effects on women, girls, LGBTI populations, migrants, refugees, and other groups on whom data and information is often still limited. Our second point, like the others have pointed out, is on funding. So for far too long, SRHR has been treated as a trade-off issue, and we believe that G7 needs to support long-term, flexible, comprehensive, and sustainable financial support for sexual and reproductive health and rights. Funding for SRHR should no longer be victim to the whims of aggressive policies like the Mexico City policy that have worldwide implications. And the G7 needs to ensure protection for these issues that are so integral and life-affecting for women and girls in all of their diversity. We're exploring ideas for targets for SRHR funding, exciting ideas like potential G7 trust funds, long-term support for groups like UNFPA, and overall just more flexible and greater financial support to women's rights organizations and grassroots organizations working on these issues. We also want SRHR funding to be holistic. Oftentimes it only focuses on response, but it should also prioritize prevention. And we'd like to see G7 countries follow through on existing commitments they've made to abortion, fertility, family planning, and adolescent girls. And our final and important point is on cross-cutting issues and intersectionality. SRHR intersects with key issues like gender-based violence, education, and awareness raising through comprehensive sexuality education in and outside of schools, and removing stigma around issues like menstruation. We also recognize the importance of focusing on SRHR in contexts of crisis, conflict, and natural disaster, and also building bridges with the Generation Equality Forum, which is making connections between SRHR, bodily autonomy, and other women's rights issues, and encouraging governments to really make tangible policy and financial commitments across the board. So our group reminded us, like all other speakers have, that women and girls don't live single issue lives, and SRHR is integral to so many lives and gender equality issues, and the G7 needs to finally protect, recognize, and most importantly, invest in rights and access. That's all. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Spogmai. Thank you for that. I think you've brought into the discussion a couple of new things. I think the whole issue of data that you flagged up as one of the things is worth of noting. You've also flagged up the issue of funding like the others, so that continues to be a thread. I think what I'm hearing though from every group is, even when we talk about resources, we are also talking about ensuring that those resources get to the communities, to women's rights organizations that are working at community level. I think that's a really important message. And then finally, I think that intersectionality issue and point, I think is really well noted. And now let's move to our last but not least rapporteur, Ndevile Mokene, who is going to give us feedback on the thematic area of climate.
Thank you, Amanda. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. From Change Group, we summarize the following points: that the G7 needs to rethink climate finance, to reassess their investment strategies, to ensure both policy development and implementation in communities is gender responsive, and considers all marginalized groups, also engage women in all areas of decision making. The other point was on increasing price on carbon and ensuring policy recommendations are centered around helping marginalized communities. Change the system on how finance is distributed, and highlight what are they divesting from. And we also need to see investment in social protection and in women's education. Another point, the last point, is that there has to be a link between green economy and care economy, taking inclusive intersectional approach in terms of funding specifically to women, local communities and indigenous peoples, and also support the development of green decent jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I probably missed a couple of things that you said. I hope everybody else was hearing you loud and clear. I think you've touched on the big question, one of the big questions around on the issue of climate, which is climate finance. And I'm so glad that one of your first points was the G7 needs to rethink climate finance. I think this year in particular, as the UK government holds the presidency of COP at the end of the year, I think it's really important for the women of the world that the issue of climate finance is actually addressed, and it's not just about climate finance, but how it's going to be distributed. So let me just say thank you to all our rapporteurs. You've done a fantastic job of giving us a brief snapshot. I can just imagine that actually in the groups, you went into so much more detail. I'm hoping that somewhere there's going to be a collation of some of the other information that you captured in your meetings. Now, before I ask Diana to come in, who is representing the UK government, to respond, I'm going to invite Lyric Thompson. Lyric is from the International Center for Research on Women and co-chair of this year's G7 Gender Global Task Force. And we're inviting her to very briefly put together and summarize the key messages from all the breakout groups. What a challenge, Lyric. And you only have 2 minutes for that. So please, you're welcome.
A daunting task, but one that you've helped me with greatly. So thanks for your interventions, Amanda. And thank you, Diana, for being willing to sit with us today and to receive these recommendations. We know that they are many and hopefully stimulating some good ideas and thinking on your part. So in brief, I think all groups are calling for a new model to the approach on their issues. We have seen in conflict and in crisis and in this pandemic, not only devastation, but the opportunity to build back better, a new economic model recognizing gender, unpaid care work, and investing in social protection, and absolutely staying away from austerity measures that we know hurt women and the most marginalized the most. On gender-based violence, which we have seen increase in this context, more and better funding for services and prevention, a call out to uphold and implement commitments like the Istanbul Convention and these important international commitments that G7 and other multilateral bodies have made, and recognizing new forms of violence, including digital violence. On women, peace, and security, the importance of policy coherence, the importance of an equal approach to implementation of our women, peace, and security commitments at home as well as abroad. This goes for feminist foreign policy as well. Taking a critical eye to the insane level of defense spending that we see across the board. We take on point that you are all operating with less funds this year, but let's make those cuts where they count, and let's protect those investments in the human fabric that helps our societies rebuild and carry on. On girls' education, I love the idea of gender transformative education and education for environmental justice and gender justice, feminist pedagogies, and including the hard issues, comprehensive sexuality education, violence, teen pregnancy, marriage, etc., letting girls lead and listening to them. On sexual and reproductive health and rights, delightful that a political declaration is forthcoming, I think also overdue. A cry for a large level of ambition there that syncs up with multilateral efforts such as the Generation Equality Forum, which will be focusing on issues like bodily autonomy. Let's make that language as bold and transformative as possible. And yes, let's include some funding targets. We're working on those numbers, and we'll get back to you on what we think they should be. But let's recognize that an unfunded mandate is useless. And finally, on climate, a very, very important call for gender responsive climate financing, including and beyond our participation in these negotiations, carbon reductions, and ensuring that a green economy is also an inclusive economy and indeed a contribution to that new economic model that we've all envisioned together. My thanks and good luck.